The winter wind swept across the Appalachian hills, carrying with it a biting chill and the dry rustle of the last autumn leaves. In the dim light of dawn, a thin veil of mist draped the valley like a white scarf, blurring the small log houses scattered along the creek. This was a Cherokee village, a community bound to the land, the forest, and the unspoken laws of nature that had sustained them for hundreds of years. Every morning here began with the deep thrum of a drum echoing from the council house. Elder I.V. stepped out from a smoke-stained doorway, his deerskin cloak drawn tight over his shoulders, his eyes as deep and still as the mountains themselves. Children trailed behind him, clutching small carved sticks, pretending to be bows. Women with woven baskets made their way to the creek, their laughter mingling with the sound of running water. Life moved slowly, as it always had, steady, predictable, or so they believed. But beyond the edge of the forest, change was coming, quiet, merciless change. Since the white settlers had begun staking claims and cutting into the surrounding land, the sounds of axes, gunshots, and foreign hoofbeats had crept into the air, once filled only with the whisper of pines and the call of birds. Whispers spread like wildfire. The federal government had passed a new law, the Indian Removal Act, and the Cherokee would have to leave their homeland. Inside the council house, the elders gathered in haste. Worry was etched into every face. I.V. sat at the center, stroking his silvered beard, his voice low and heavy. This is our ancestors' land. For generations, the Cherokee have been born here, lived here, and laid their dead in the soil. Now they say we must leave. But leave for where the West, a place none of us have seen, who will tend to the graves of our fathers. Outside, snow began to fall in lazy spirals. A young girl named Aylin stood by the doorway, listening in secret. She was only 11, yet her dark eyes already carried the shadow of worry. Her father was the finest hunter in the village. Her mother wove cloth and told her the old stories of the Great Spirit who shaped the mountains and rivers, of the birds that carried the souls of ancestors across the valley each winter. Aylin loved every inch of this land, from the smooth rock by the creek to the ancient oak where she climbed to watch the sun slip behind the hills. Word of the removal order reached every home. Some refused to believe it. Others were gripped by panic. Still, a few clung to the hope that some miracle might turn the tide. But weeks later, soldiers rode into the village, rifles slung across their backs, bayonets glinting, a red-sealed document in hand. The order was read aloud. All Cherokee were to prepare to leave, taking only what they could carry on their backs. That night, no one slept. The drum beat slow and mournful. Families gathered around their fires, their shadows long against the walls. Mothers folded half-finished cloths. Men buried treasured family heirlooms in shallow pits. Children clung to carved dolls. A I.V. moved from house to house, urging unity, telling them to carry seeds of corn and beans, the promise of future harvests. The next morning, snow blanketed the trail leading out of the valley. Under a leaden sky, the Cherokee people began their walk. The old, leaned on canes children were carried on their mothers' hips, baskets and bundles strapped with leather thongs. Aylin looked back at her family's cabin, smoke still curling from its roof, as though the village didn't yet know it was being left behind. A tear slipped down her cheek, but her father's hand tightened on her shoulder, urging her forward. The road ahead stretched endlessly into the white horizon. Aylin didn't yet know that this journey would forever be remembered with a name that would make every Cherokee heart tighten when spoken, the Trail of Tears. The first day felt like a long breath held too long. Snow sifted down in quiet flakes that found every seam of cloth and skin. Boots and bare feet alike pressed into the whitening mud, leaving a ribbon of dark, trampled earth behind the line. Soldiers rode the margins with little to say beyond hoarse commands. Keep moving, keep close, no stragglers. The creek that used to sing through the village ran beside them for a while, as if it too were trying to follow. But soon even that familiar sound fell away, swallowed by the hush of the winter forest and the creak of wagon wheels. Aylin walked between her mother and father, the handle of a small basket biting into her palm. Inside, it wrapped in a scrap of woven cloth, were seeds, corn, and beans her mother had saved and tied into little bundles, each labeled with a smudge of charcoal. At first, it had seemed strange to bring soil's promise to a road that grew out of frost and sorrow. But her mother had said a people is a tree that carries its own roots, and Aylin had decided to believe her. By midday, the sky had leveled into a gray lid. They stopped at a narrow clearing to divide rations hardtack and salted pork that smelled sharp and metallic. Some of the elders sat legs, shaking backs braced against packs. Some of the women heated water in iron pots. The soldiers let them keep adding handfuls of meal to make a paste they could swallow. Elder Ahivi stood near the front where the captain unrolled maps and pointed west with a leather-gloved finger. His breath made ghosts as he listened, but Aylin saw the flint in his jaw. When the captain finished, Ahivi only nodded once, as if to the earth itself, then moved among the people, sharing a word here, a touch there, a hand on a shoulder, a story to push back the cold. Afternoon brought a wind that needled through cloth. It found the seams of Aylin's courage too. She tried not to look back, but her mind filled with pictures of the oak that anchored the ridge above their old home, of the smooth rock by the creek, where crayfish hid of the sun slipping behind the same notch in the hills day after day, like a bead along a thread. She slipped her free hand into her father's. He looked down the lines beside his eyes, deepening. "Keep your eyes on what's ahead," he said, though he glanced back once himself. "Sometimes that's the only way the heart follows." They came to a shallow ford before dusk. The water ran black and slow, with rims of ice along the edges like cracked glass. A soldier rode into the stream first, then waved the people on. The first few to cross hissed as their feet met the current. An old man in a patched blanket lost his footing and crashed to his knees. Aylin's father dropped the basket and lunged without thinking, catching him under the arms and hauling him upright. The old man's face shone with water and shock. "I thought the river had me," he wheezed. "Not yet," Aylin's father said, and he did not let go until both had climbed to the far bank. They camped that night in a grove of skeletal trees. The soldiers had them stack brush and deadfall, and a few small fires bloomed like red flowers among the trunks. Smoke rose thin and straight in the still air. Aylin's mother dug into the basket, set one of the bundles of seeds near their fire to warm as if it were a sleeping infant. "They feel the cold, too," she whispered half to herself. Aylin leaned in close and could almost imagine she heard the small, secret sigh of kernels softening. A woman from the next family over brought a pot, and soon there were several of them, women in Shoal's faces, pinked from the wind, sharing what meal and scraps they had. One began a song low and steady, the kind that used to rise in the council house at planting time. Others joined. The notes were a path their feet could not stray, from a memory no soldier could confiscate. Aylin hummed under her breath, following the sound as it curled between trees and sank into the snow at their feet. Later, when the fires had eaten down and the night took its long breath, Aylin lay awake. Somewhere, a baby coughed. Somewhere, an elder muttered in his sleep. A horse shifted tack, jingling softly. She rolled onto her side and watched the dark shape of her father by the fire, feeding it a small stick at a time, as if listening for something inside the wood. "Tell me a story," she said, the words puffing white. He looked over the firelight, making his face strange and kind at once. "Which one?" "The one about the river that remembers." He smiled with only his eyes. There was a river that ran as all rivers do, from high ground to lower ground, from stone to sand. But this river had a memory. It remembered the trout that broke its skin on spring mornings, the deer that drank in August heat, the boys who jumped from its rocks to prove they were brave. It remembered how, after the first frost, the elders walked beside it and spoke thanks. One winter, men came and dammed it, and turned it into a long, still lake that swallowed the rocks. People said the river was gone, but the river remembered the path. It had cut the old bed beneath the water, and each spring it pulled a little silt from the dam and whispered to itself, "In the mud, I am still a river." Aylin closed her eyes. "Are we like that?" Her father laid another stick on the fire and watched the flame catch. "We are." Morning tore open, cold and blue. The line moved again. By midday, they reached a knuckled ridge where the snow lay deeper. A wagon's wheel hit a buried root and shattered. The driver cursed and the axle twisted into the ground. The people behind had to stop crowding and stomping their feet to keep feeling in their toes while the soldiers argued. Aylin stood on tiptoe to see. A private with a narrow face and red ears peeled off from the group and walked toward the Cherokee side, a cloth bundle in his hand. He hesitated, glancing back at his captain, then bent and placed the bundle near an old woman's lap. Bread still warm enough to steam in the air. The old woman stared at it as if it were a deer stepping into a clearing. The private didn't wait for thanks. He walked away fast, eyes pinned to the snow. Aylin watched him go, a confusion of heat and hurt inside her. The world had made him into a soldier. That afternoon, the wind picked up again, finding every edge of their resolve. A boy, a little younger than Aylin, shivered so hard his teeth chattered. His mother lifted him and tried to tuck his legs under her shawl, but the shawl was already full. She had a baby strapped to her chest, tiny cries lost in the air. Elder Ahivi fell back from the front and slipped his own blanket from his shoulders. He wrapped it around the boy without a word. The boy's mother began to protest, but Ai lifted a hand and the argument died in her throat. He walked on, then shoulders bare to the knife of the wind, and the soldiers watched him pass as if they had never seen age look so tall. They reached the stockade by dusk, rough-hewn walls, where so many had been gathered before being marched again. Inside, the ground was churned and stained by other feet, other nights. Aylin felt something in her chest go quiet the way a bird goes still when a hawk passes. They were counted, assigned a corner to huddle in, told there would be travel at first light. A measles rash had bloomed on a child in another family. Whispers ran like mice. Mothers tried to press cloths to foreheads and cheeks, tried not to think of graves cut into frozen ground. Aylin's mother took out a tiny shard of charcoal and a sliver of soft wood. The labeled seed sticks were more than labels. They were letters, two symbols her mother had learned to draw from a cousin who treasured the syllabary. When we sit, her mother said, we remember. She wrote on the stick as Aylin watched names of the hills and water and winds in the language that rolled like creek stones in Aylin's ears. She spoke them softly, as if calling them to heel, like dogs that had run too far. This is how a people survives, she said. We carry what is ours in our mouths until we can plant it again. Night fell heavy inside the stockade. The stars showed cold and remote through the gaps in the logs. Somewhere, a man was praying in a low voice with a rhythm that matched the first steps Aylin had taken as a toddler. Somewhere, a woman stitched by firelight, the needle flashing like a brief thought. Aylin leaned against her mother and felt the seeds press into her side, small, hard, real. A gust sent a curl of smoke across her face, and for a moment she smelled their old hearth, heard the creak, saw the oak. The memory rose and did not break. She held it as carefully as she had held the basket all day. When she finally slept, she dreamed of the river that remembered cutting its way through stone with patience and song. The dawn broke brittle and pale, a thin wash of light spilling between the stockade's rough timbers. Breath rose from the gathered Cherokee in ghostly plumes, the air thick with the smell of wood smoke, damp earth, and the sharp edge of fear. A soldier's shout cracked the morning stillness, ordering them to form up. Boots thudded in the frost as people rose, gathering their meager bundles, tightening shawls and blankets. Aylin's father lifted the seed basket from where it had lain beside their sleeping mat. He handed it to her without a word, as if to remind her that even on a road of loss, some things must be carried by choice. Her mother adjusted the strap of her own bundle, glancing to where Elder Ahivi stood speaking to the captain in low, deliberate tones. Whatever words passed between them ended quickly. The captain's expression was stone, the elder's calm as a winter sky before snow. The gates creaked open, and the line began to move again. They left behind the stockade and stepped into a world drained of color. The ground crunched underfoot, patches of ice glazing the ruts left by wagons. Somewhere ahead, a river lay across their path. Its surface rippled under the breath of the wind. Aylin could hear it before she saw it, a low, steady murmur that reminded her of the creek back home. When they reached the bank, the current was dark and fast, flecked with thin sheets of ice drifting like broken mirrors. The soldiers herded them across a shallow stretch where the water came to the knee. Aylin's legs burned as the cold bit through her skin, the weight of the basket dragging at her arm. A man ahead of her stumbled, clutching a little girl to his chest. Aylin's father stepped forward, steadying him until they reached the far side. Beyond the river lay a stretch of open plain, the horizon a wavering line where snow met sky. They walked through it for hours, the wind sweeping unhindered across the flat land. It stole breath and warmth, tugged at blankets, and pressed against them like an invisible wall. The soldiers barked for them to keep pace. Stragglers were urged forward with curt commands. By midday, the plain gave way to a stand of leafless trees. Here, the column was called to a halt. Fires were kindled from fallen branches, and the smell of smoke and boiling meal drifted through the air. Aylin sat close to the flames, holding her numb hands over the heat until the prickling ache of returning blood made her wince. Her mother ladled a thin porridge into a tin cup, blowing on it before passing it to her. Across the clearing, Elder Ahivi knelt beside a young man whose leg was bound with a strip of cloth. The binding was stained dark. The man's face was pale with fever. Ahivi spoke to him softly, words Aylin could not hear before rising and walking toward the soldiers. There was a short exchange, the elder's voice low but firm, the soldiers sharp and dismissive. In the end, Ahivi returned with only a shake of his head, yet his eyes were steady. That night, the temperature plunged. The wind moaned through the branches above, carrying with it the dry whisper of snow yet to come. Families huddled close around their fires, sharing blankets, passing small morsels of food from hand to hand. Somewhere in the dark, a baby cried. Somewhere else, an old man sang a prayer in a voice cracked but unwavering. Aylin lay between her parents, the seed basket tucked beneath her arm like a talisman. She dreamed again of the river her father had told her about, not dammed, but flowing free, its waters warm as summer rain carrying her village on its back. In the dream, the oak tree from the ridge stood at the water's edge, its branches full of leaves, even in winter. Beneath its roots, the seeds in her basket stirred, pressing upward toward the light. Morning came with the whisper of snow falling through bare branches. The world beyond the fire's reach had turned white, each step muffled in a soft, treacherous silence. The march began again, the line moving like a dark thread stitched across a pale cloth. Aylin's feet ached, her shoulders burned, but she kept her eyes forward. The road stretched on unbroken toward a horizon she could not yet imagine. Somewhere ahead, beyond the snow and wind, was a place the soldiers called the New Lands. To Aylin, it was only an empty name. But in her mother's eyes, when they met hers over the rim of the basket, she saw something else, something like the stubborn green of a corn shoot pushing through cold soil. The trail was long, and the winter unforgiving, but the seeds were still warm against her side, and the people still walked. The snow deepened as the trail wound westward, swallowing footprints almost as soon as they were made. The wind no longer felt like something that passed over them. It had become a presence, an unseen rider pacing the column, leaning close to test each traveler's will. Breath plumed from every mouth in short bursts, and the sound of shuffling feet was broken only by the occasional creak of a wagon axle or the dull thud of a soldier's horse shifting in the drifts. Aylin's father walked just behind Elder Ahivi, now his tall frame acting as a windbreak for his daughter. The elder's shoulders were bare again, his blanket given to a child 2 days before, yet he strode as if the cold were an old acquaintance. From time to time, he murmured to those beside him small words of encouragement, a memory of a hunt, a proverb that had traveled as far as their people had. The group crested a low rise near midday, revealing a frozen creek that twisted like a silver scar across the plain. Its surface was broken here and there by dark water, the current hidden but strong beneath. A rickety wooden bridge spanned the narrowest point, no wider than a wagon, its planks slick with ice. The soldiers ordered the families across one at a time, wary of the weight. Aylin clutched the seed basket to her chest as her family stepped onto the boards, each footfall a creak and groan beneath them. She kept her eyes fixed on the far bank, refusing to look down at the dark mouth of water yawning below. On the other side, they paused only long enough to breathe before the march continued. Snow began to fall again, heavier this time, thickening the air, until the world seemed smaller, closer, like walking inside a cloud. Shapes blurred. The people ahead became shadows in the white. Aylin gripped her mother's hand to keep from losing her. By late afternoon, the column entered a stand of pines whose green needles whispered with the weight of snow. The trees broke the wind and the air felt almost warm by comparison. Here, the soldiers called a halt. Fires were coaxed to life from damp wood, the smoke rising in lazy spirals toward a sky already dimming. Aylin's mother spread a woven cloth on the ground, shaking the snow from its edges before setting down their bundle. She unwrapped a small portion of dried venison, cutting it into strips and passing them to Aylin and her father. The meat was tough, but the salt and smoke filled her mouth with a taste that carried echoes of home. Across the camp, a commotion rose. A wagon wheel had split and one of the horses had gone lame. Soldiers argued in curt voices about whether to leave the wagon behind. A young Cherokee man, barely more than a boy, stepped forward, offering to carry some of the load himself. Others joined him, their faces grim but resolute. Together, they began transferring supplies to be carried by hand. Aylin watched, feeling a quiet pride stir beneath her fatigue. That night, as the camp settled, Elder Ahivi gathered a small circle near his fire. He began to speak, not in the language of the soldiers, but in the rolling syllables of their own tongue. Aylin leaned closer, her mother's arm around her as the elder told a story of their people's first winter in the mountains long ago. He spoke of hardship and hunger, of snow, so deep it swallowed the lodges, and of the hunters who returned at last with enough meat to see the village through. His voice wove the past into the present, reminding them that the Cherokee had faced winters before and had endured. When he finished, there was a silence broken only by the hiss of snow falling into the fire. Aylin's father looked into the flames and said almost to himself, "We are still those people." Her mother squeezed his hand and Aylin felt the seeds in the basket warm from the fire's nearness. Outside, the ring of pines, the wind still moved across the plain, carrying with it the scent of distances yet to come. But inside the camp for a little while, the cold seemed held at bay, not by the fires, but by the shared weight of their history. And when they rose, the next morning, stepping once more into the snow, it was with the quiet knowledge that every step westward carried not only their bodies, but their story. The morning after the pine grove was a harder kind of cold one that didn't just sit on the skin but sank deep into bone and breath. Frost rimmed every thread of cloth, turning shawls and blankets into stiff shells. The snow underfoot had frozen in the night, so each step cracked like breaking glass. Even the soldiers moved slower, their horses' hooves striking the ground with dull, reluctant thuds. Aylin walked with her chin tucked into her mother's side, the seed basket cradled beneath her cloak. She listened to the creak of leather straps, the occasional cough, the rhythmic hiss of feet pushing through crusted snow. Somewhere ahead, a wagon groaned under its load, the driver muttering to the horses as if coaxing an old friend. They came to a stretch of land where the snow thinned, revealing the black mud beneath. Here, the trail narrowed between two low ridges and the wind funneled through like a blade. Families leaned into it, heads down, breath tearing from their lungs. The soldiers barked for them to keep pace. There was no shelter here, no place to stop until they reached the next stand of trees. Aylin's father dropped back to walk beside an old woman whose bundle seemed to weigh her nearly to the ground. Without a word, he took it from her shoulders and slung it across his own. The woman's eyes shone with gratitude, though her lips trembled too much to speak. Aylin saw her father's jaw set against the extra weight, but his steps did not slow. By midday, they reached a cluster of bare cottonwoods along a frozen creek. The captain gave the order to halt. Fires were lit, though the wood was so green it smoked more than it burned. People huddled in the gray haze, hands stretched toward the reluctant flames. Aylin's mother passed her a tin cup of warm water, the steam curling like thin fingers. She drank slowly, savoring the heat in her mouth before it could vanish. On the far side of the camp, a small boy sat alone, rocking back and forth with his knees drawn to his chest. His face was pale, his eyes unfocused. Aylin recognized him. His mother had fallen ill days ago and now lay wrapped in blankets beside one of the wagons. Aylin glanced at her parents, then crossed the trampled snow to kneel beside him. From the pocket of her cloak, she pulled a kernel of corn from the seed basket. She pressed it into his palm, closing his fingers around it. "It's for planting," she whispered, "when the ground is warm again." The boy stared at his hand as if she had given him a jewel. For a moment, the distant look in his eyes eased. That night, the snow returned, drifting in slow, silent spirals. Elder Ahivi walked the camp's perimeter, stopping at each family's fire. At Aylin's, he knelt and rested a hand on the basket in her lap. "Guard these," he said, his gaze steady on hers. "They are not just seeds. They are the voice of your people waiting to speak again." Aylin nodded, feeling the weight of his words settle beside the warmth of the flames. She thought of the boy with the corn kernel of the old woman her father had helped, of the way the wind carried both cold and the faint scent of pine from the grove they had left behind. Somewhere in the darkness beyond the camp, a wolf howled a long, low sound that rose and fell like a question. The elder said wolves remembered their pack across great distances, calling until the answer came. Aylin wondered if their people were like that too. Each step west, a call, each seed, a promise that someday the answer would return. When the fires burned low and the snow lay thick over the footprints of the day, she lay awake for a long time, listening to the wind, the crackle of the last embers, and the slow, steady breathing of her parents beside her. Morning would come soon enough, and with it, another stretch of the long road they had no choice but to follow. The next morning broke without color, just a dim gray light that seemed to seep from the snow itself. The fires were little more than smoldering pits, their ashes frozen into brittle shells. Soldiers moved through the camp, prodding the still sleeping with the butts of their rifles, urging them to rise. The march would not wait for warmth. Aylin's breath fogged before her as she packed the seed basket under her cloak. Kernels inside shifted with a muted rustle, like a whisper too faint to catch. She fell into step beside her mother, her father leading the way through the churned snow. The day's trail began with a long climb over a low ridge. The snow here was crusted hard, and each step broke through with a crunch. The line of travelers stretched behind them, a wavering thread of dark shapes against the pale expanse. Aylin's calves ached with the slope, but the ridge's crest promised a change in view. When they reached it, the land beyond opened wide, a frozen lake flat and silver under the clouded sky. The soldiers led them along its edge, warning against walking across. The ice, they said, would not bear their weight. The wind coming off the lake was sharp and constant, filling ears with a low, unending roar. Midway along the shore, they passed a cluster of cabins, abandoned their roofs, bowed under snow. A few of the Cherokee glanced toward them with longing. Even empty walls looked like shelter in this cold. But the soldiers kept the pace, steady eyes forward. By midday, clouds thickened overhead and fine flakes began to fall again. The snow gathered in eyelashes, melted into collars, and dampened the blankets that had once been warm. The lake gave way to a narrow valley where the trail wound between steep banks. Here the wind was gentler and voices carried. Aylin heard someone singing far ahead. A woman's voice, thin but clear, tracing an old melody. Others began to join their tones, layering like threads in a woven cloth. The song traveled down the line until it reached Aylin's ears. She recognized it. Her mother had sung it, while spinning thread a tune about planting in the spring, about the first green shoots and the smell of fresh earth. Hearing it here among snow and strangers was like feeling a hand pressed to her back, steadying her steps. They made camp early that evening in a sheltered hollow. The soldiers allowed small fires, and the pines around them bent under the snow, their branches forming low, protective arches. Aylin's father returned from gathering wood with a bundle of dry twigs hidden under his coat, enough to spark their fire without choking it in smoke. While her parents worked over the flames, Aylin wandered to the edge of camp. She found Elder Ahivi seated on a log, mending a strap with careful stitches. The elder looked up, his breath curling in the cold. "Your feet are steady," he said, note a quiet step. "I'm trying," she answered. He nodded, his eyes narrowing as if he could see beyond the hollow, past the ridges and rivers still ahead. Steady feet carry more than the body. They carry memory. Every step you take here is a thread that ties you to those walking beside you and to those who walked before. Aylin sat beside him, listening to the muted crackle of their fire and the muffled voices of the camp. Somewhere beyond the pines, the frozen lake reflected the last of the day's light, a pale echo of the sun they had not seen in weeks. That night, as she lay between her parents, Aylin traced the rim of the seed basket with her fingertips. The kernels inside shifted again, the sound small but certain. She thought of the song from the March of the Cabins by the lake of Elder Ahivi's words about steady feet. The road was still long, but she began to understand this journey was not only about leaving, it was also about carrying. And carrying, she realized, could be a way of keeping something alive. The following day began in a hush, as if the snow itself had drawn a blanket over the world. The pines around the hollow stood still, their branches heavy with white, and the air held a fragile quiet that made every sound sharper. The crunch of boots, the faint jingle of harness chains, the creak of leather under strain. The columns set out before the light fully woke their breath, rising in clouds that hung low over the trail. Aylin kept close to her father, the seed basket secure beneath her cloak. She had begun to measure time, not by days or miles, but by the small things that broke the monotony: a bird darting from a thicket, the sudden glimpse of a frozen stream, a word of kindness passed down the line. By late morning, the land began to change. The trail dipped into a shallow valley where the snow lay deeper, and the wind was muted by the rise of the hills. Tracks of deer crisscrossed the drifts, their delicate imprints, a reminder that other lives still moved through this winter. Aylin's father pointed them out, telling her how the deer would bed down under dense thickets to wait out the cold, and how a hunter could read the story of their passing in the snow. In the valley's center stood a grove of bare sycamores, their pale bark shining ghost-like against the white. Here, the soldiers called a halt. Wagons were drawn up in a loose semicircle, and fires were kindled in the center. Aylin helped her mother gather fallen branches, their fingers stiff and red from the cold. While they worked, a boy, no older than herself, approached. She recognized him as the one she had given the corn kernel 2 days before. He held it out to her, now wrapped in a strip of cloth. "Keep it safe," he said simply. "I don't want to lose it." She closed her fingers over it, feeling its hard, perfect weight. In the afternoon, clouds moved in heavy from the west, carrying a shadow that turned the snow a dull gray. The wind began to rise again, worrying at cloaks and blankets. The soldiers urged them onward. There was no shelter here if the storm thickened. The climb out of the valley was slow, the snow deepening with every step. Aylin's legs burned, but she kept her pace, focusing on the steady rhythm of her father's boots ahead of her. Behind, she could hear the labored breathing of an older man, his steps faltering. Without breaking stride, Elder Ahivi fell back to walk beside him, his arms slipping under the man's to take some of the weight. By the time they reached the ridge, the wind was a living thing curling through the line with icy fingers. The soldiers shouted to be heard, driving them down the far slope toward a stand of oaks where camp would be made. Fires were coaxed to life quickly, the promise of warmth urging weary hands to work faster. That night, snow hissed softly into the flames, and the air was thick with the smell of smoke and damp wool. Aylin sat close to her mother, turning the boy's kernel in her palm. The 2 seeds, his and the ones in her basket, felt like companions in the same long journey, each holding a future no one could yet see. Her father returned from speaking with Elder Ahivi, his expression serious but calm. "The storm will pass," he said, settling beside them. "It always does." Aylin looked at the fire, then at the dark beyond where snowflakes caught the light and vanished again. She thought of the deer tracks in the valley of the sycamores, standing pale against the storm of the boy who had trusted her with his only seed. And she knew that even if the wind scoured the trail clean by morning, their passing would remain, if not in the snow, then in the things they carried and in the hands that carried them. The storm came in the night, like a slow tide first, as a whisper against the canvas tarps and wool blankets, then as a steady hiss that buried every sound but its own. By morning, the world beyond the camp had vanished into a pale blur. Snow lay high against the wagons, and the air was so thick with falling flakes that the oaks seemed to dissolve into the whiteness just a few paces away. The soldiers were tense. Storms slowed the march, and slowing meant more mouths to feed from dwindling supplies. Orders came quickly. Move, keep moving, don't linger in the cold. Fires were stamped out, bundles lifted, and the long line of Cherokee began to thread its way through the trees, their figures swallowed one by one into the drifting white. Aylin stayed between her parents, the seed basket pressed against her ribs. The snow was powdery and deep, pulling at her legs with each step. More than once, she stumbled, her father's hand catching her elbow before she fell. Around them, the shapes of others came and went in the shifting veil of snow faces, rimmed with frost eyes narrowed against the wind. By midday, the storm had begun to thin, revealing a stretch of open ground ahead. The wind, no longer muffled by trees, cut across the plain with a force that made Aylin gasp. In the distance, black shapes dotted the horizon, bison moving slow and deliberate through the drifts. A murmur rippled through the line. Some of the elders took it as a sign of resilience, a reminder that life endured even here. The soldiers kept them moving, guiding them toward a small rise crowned with evergreens. There, the camp took shape in a half circle against the slope. Fires were lit quickly, the green needles of the pines crackling in the flames. Aylin's mother set a pot over their fire, the thin steam rising like a fragile thread to the gray sky. As they ate, Elder Ivy moved among the families, checking on the sick and the old. When he reached Aylin's fire, he knelt, his breath misting in the cold. From inside his cloak, he drew a small pouch and placed it in her hands. "These," he said, "are from my own store. Plant them beside yours when the time comes." Two voices grow stronger together. Aylin loosened the cord and peeked inside sunflower seeds, their striped shells smooth under her fingers. She looked up to thank him, but the elder had already moved on his steps, slow but unwavering. That night, the storm returned lighter, this time dusting the camp in a fresh layer of white. The fires burned low, casting long shadows that trembled across the snow. Aylin lay curled under her blanket, the pouch of sunflower seeds tucked into the basket beside the corn and beans. She thought about how seeds could survive winters far harsher than this, waiting in the dark for the right season to speak. Sleep came slowly, the wind's moan weaving through her dreams. She saw fields again, not the frozen plains they crossed now, but wide stretches of green dotted with yellow blooms and tall stalks heavy with grain. In the dream, her people's voices rose in song, the words carrying across the land like roots searching for one another beneath the soil. When she woke at dawn, the world was still white and cold, but the seeds were warm against her side. She took that as a sign worth carrying into the next day's march. The next day began under a sky, the color of pewter, heavy and low, as if it might press the land flat beneath it. The storm had passed, but it had left the world reshaped drifts taller than a man-blocked parts of the trail, and the open plain ahead was a quilt of white stitched with faint shadows. The cold was sharper now, the kind that turned breath into a quicksilver mist and made even strong hands tremble when tying a strap. The soldiers set the pace faster than usual, pushing to make up the distance lost to the storm. Boots sank into the snow, breaking through the crust with every step. Aylin's legs ached, but she matched her parents' pace, the seed basket steady under her arm. Around her, the sound of travel was subdued. No idle talk, just the steady crunch of feet and the creak of leather. By mid-morning, they came to a narrow river, its surface mostly frozen except for a black ribbon of current running down the middle. A crude wooden ferry, little more than planks nailed to a flat frame, waited at the bank. It could carry only a few at a time, so the crossing was slow, each trip dragging minutes into hours. The wind off the water bit at faces and fingers. Aylin and her family waited their turn near the back. She watched as Elder Ivy guided a frail man onto the ferry, steadying him as the planks rocked under their weight. On the far side, other Cherokee reached to help them off hands, gripping hands until both stood safe on the snow. That simple gesture, the unbroken chain of grasp and release, stayed with her as they finally stepped aboard. The ferry groaned, the current nudging against its sides. Aylin kept her eyes on the far bank, her fingers tight on the basket. The moment they reached land, she felt her knees give a little, the relief almost dizzying. On the other side, the trail wound upward into low hills. Climb was slow, the snow thinner here, but the incline stealing breath from every step. At the crest, they found a stand of bare elms where the soldiers called a rest. Families collapsed onto packs or leaned against tree trunks, steam rising from damp clothes. Aylin sat with her back to an elm, closing her eyes for a moment. She felt the weight of the seeds against her ribs, the faint shift inside the basket. Her mother pressed a small strip of dried venison into her hand, and they ate in silence, watching the wind scatter loose snow across the clearing. Before they moved on, Aylin noticed a boy shivering violently a few paces away. His blanket was too thin for the cold. Without thinking, she slipped from under her own, folded it once, and draped it over his shoulders. He looked up, startled, then pulled it tight around himself without a word. Aylin didn't need thanks. She had learned by now that some kindnesses were simply part of the road, like fire in the night or water from a stream. That evening, they camped in a hollow between the hills. The air was still and the snow muffled every sound, making the camp feel like a place apart from the world. Elder Ahivi came to their fire, his face lit by the flicker of flames. "Trail is long," he said quietly, "but every step we take together makes it shorter." Aylin thought about that as she curled beside the fire, the seeds tucked safe against her side. The hills around them seemed to listen, their shadows bending close, as if they too were part of the journey now. The night in the hollow had been the kind that seeps into dreams, silent, cold, and heavy. When morning came, the frost clung to every surface, even the eyelashes of those still stirring from sleep. The fires were coaxed back to life with stiff fingers, their thin warmth drawing people close before the call to move on. The trail ahead led them out of the hills and back into open country. Here, the snow was patchy wind scoured in places to reveal the brown earth beneath. The sight of bare ground lifted spirits. If only a little, it meant easier walking, fewer drifts to wade through. Aylin could feel the difference in her stride, her legs grateful for the change. By midday, they reached a frozen marsh. The tall grasses lay flat under the weight of ice, their pale stalks crackling in the wind. The soldiers led them along a narrow ridge of firm ground, warning them not to stray. The ice was treacherous, and already a mule had broken through its cries, carrying far before it was pulled free. Aylin kept her eyes ahead, focusing on her father's steady back and the rhythmic sway of the seed basket under her arm. Her mother walked just behind, humming softly, a tune Aylin recognized as one of the planting songs, though here it sounded more like a prayer. That afternoon, they passed an abandoned homestead, a sagging barn, its roof caved under snow, and a cabin with a door swinging loose on its hinges. The sight stirred a quiet longing in many eyes. Even the soldiers slowed their pace, their gazes flicking toward the shelter it might have offered. But the captain urged them on. Stopping there would only invite the cold to settle deeper into their bones. They camped that night beside a frozen creek. The ice was clear enough to see dark water moving sluggishly beneath, a reminder that not everything in winter was entirely asleep. Aylin crouched at the edge, her reflection wavering under the shifting surface. She thought of the river. Her father had told her about the one that remembered its old path beneath a still lake. While her parents prepared their meager meal, Elder Ahivi gathered several children by a small fire. He told them a story of the first seeds ever planted by their people, how they had been carried from the mountains to the plains in a deerskin pouch, guarded through storms and across rivers. "We are walking that story now," he said, his eyes catching the firelight. "And one day someone will tell of you the way I tell of them." Aylin felt the truth of it settle inside her. The basket under her arm was not just a burden. It was a line that connected her to people she had never met, whose footsteps she was now walking in. That night, as she lay beneath her blanket, the wind rattled the bare branches above like a distant drum. She imagined it was the earth itself keeping time, marking the beats of their journey. Tomorrow, they would rise again and follow that rhythm step by step toward a land none of them had seen, but all of them carried in their hearts. The creek had frozen solid overnight, a glassy ribbon glinting under the first thin light of dawn. The camp was slow to wake. The cold had stiffened every joint, turned blankets brittle, and left the air so sharp that each breath scraped the throat. When the soldiers gave the call to move, people rose reluctantly, stomping their feet to stir warmth into them before lifting their bundles. The trail led them along the frozen water's edge, the ice groaning faintly under the weight of the cold. Aylin kept her eyes on the glinting surface, half expecting to see fish swimming beneath, but the blackness below was still. The seed basket was snug beneath her cloak, its weight now a familiar comfort against her ribs. By mid-morning, the path bent westward toward a line of low bluffs. The climb was steady, the ground here more earth than snow, and the sound of boots striking soil instead of crusted ice felt strange after so many days. At the top, the land opened into a wide, windswept plain dotted with stunted trees and patches of yellow grass poking through the frost. The wind was harsher here, free to race across the open ground without obstacle. They walked in near silence, broken only by the occasional call of a soldier or the cough of someone in the line. Aylin noticed a woman a few paces ahead falter her bundle, slipping from her shoulder. Before it hit the ground, Elder Ahivi's hand was there, catching it, his other arm steadying her. She nodded in thanks, her breath ragged, and together they rejoined the march. By midday, the captain allowed a brief halt in the lee of a small rise. Fires were lit quickly, but there was no time for more than warm water and a mouthful of dried food. Aylin's mother shared half of her portion with a child who had done the gesture unnoticed by the soldiers, but not by Aylin. The afternoon brought clouds that thickened into a dull ceiling, and soon fine snow began to fall, slow at first, then heavier, clinging to hair and cloth, until every traveler looked dusted in white. The plain seemed endless, and the horizon never grew closer. When camp was finally called, it was in a shallow depression ringed by bare shrubs. The fires here smoked more than they burned, fed by damp branches scavenged from the sparse growth. Still, people huddled close, drawing what warmth they could. Aylin sat with her parents, the basket between her knees, and listened to the wind's low hum through the shrubs. Her father spoke quietly about the land they were heading toward, how it was said to have wide fields, rivers that stayed full even in summer, and soil dark enough to grow anything. Her mother's eyes reflected the firelight, but her face was unreadable. Across the camp, Elder Ahivi's voice rose in a prayer, the words flowing in the Cherokee tongue, each one deliberate and steady. It was a prayer for the living, for the sick, and for those who had already fallen along the way. The sound carried through the camp, settling like a thin blanket over every fire. That night, Aylin dreamed of walking through a green field where the seeds in her basket had grown tall, their leaves whispering together in the wind. In the dream, she was not cold, and no one was urging her forward. They were already home. The next morning began with the brittle crack of ice breaking under boots as the camp stirred. A thin frost had settled over everything in the night, turning each bundle and blanket into something fragile looking but heavy with damp. The fires long dead left only cold ash that the wind scattered across the shallow hollow where they had slept. The trail out of camp rose gently at first, then more steeply toward a ridge of bare rock streaked with snow. Aylin followed her father's boots, watching his steady tread trying to match her steps to his. The seed basket was tucked close under her cloak, its weight now a constant something that had become part of her balance. The climb slowed the entire column, especially for the old and the sick. A man 2 families ahead stumbled, catching himself against a boulder. Without hesitation, Elder Ahivi moved to his side, letting the man rest a moment before they continued together. Aylin saw this happen again and again, someone faltering, another hand steadying them, the march resuming without a word. When they reached the crest, the wind met them head-on, flattening blankets against backs and pushing tears from eyes. But beyond it lay a sight unlike any they had seen for days. A wide river frozen in great slabs with channels of dark water winding between. The soldiers began leading the column toward a crossing point where the ice looked thick enough to hold. The crossing was slow and tense. Each step on the ice made a low, hollow groan, and people kept their eyes on the far bank, willing themselves forward. Aylin felt her father's hand firm on her shoulder as they moved, the seed basket bumping gently against her ribs with each step. When her boots finally touched solid ground again, she let out a breath she hadn't realized she was holding. On the far bank, the ground rose into rolling hills dotted here and there with stands of winter bare trees. The air here smelled different, cleaner, with a hint of something green even in the heart of winter. The captain called a short halt to let people catch their breath before pushing on. Aylin's mother shared a strip of venison with her, the salt sharp on her tongue. That night they camped on a slope sheltered by a low ridge. The wind passed overhead a muted roar, leaving the fires below to burn steady and bright. Aylin sat between her parents, turning a sunflower seed between her fingers. She thought about Elder Ahivi's words that two voices grow stronger together, and imagined a future where corn beans and sunflowers grew side by side, their roots tangled deep in the same soil. Before sleep, Elder Ahivi visited their fire. His gaze moved from Aylin to the basket. "You're guarding more than seeds now," he said. "You're guarding the memory of this road. One day you'll plant both." Aylin nodded, the truth of it heavy and warm in her chest. She knew then that no matter how far they walked, this journey would not end at the edge of the new land. It would live on in what they carried and what they chose to keep alive. That night, the stars were sharp above the ridge, their cold light spilling over the camp. Aylin lay awake for a while, listening to the quiet breathing of her parents, the occasional crack of ice shifting on the river below, and the steady beat of her own heart, a rhythm that matched the road step for step. The following morning dawned beneath a sky streaked with thin ribbons of pale gold. It was the first sunrise Aylin had seen in many days, and though the air was still sharp enough to sting her nose, the light seemed to loosen something in her chest. Around her, others noticed two faces turning eastward, shoulders lifting ever so slightly under the weight of their bundles. The trail wound down from the ridge into a broad, open valley. Snow still lay in shaded hollows, but here and there the ground showed dark and bare, as if the earth itself was pushing back against winter. The soldiers set a steady pace, their voices carrying farther in the open air. By midday they reached a shallow river, its surface rippling with dark water instead of ice. The crossing was bitter, the cold rushing past their knees like liquid knives, but the footing was firm, and on the far side the sun broke briefly through the clouds. Aylin stood on the bank, catching her breath, watching steam rise from the wet wool of her cloak. The seed basket was dry. She had held it high through the water, as though the kernels inside might drown. That afternoon they passed the remains of another camp, ashes scattered on the ground, blackened stones where fires had once burned. The sight brought a hush to the line. Elder Ahivi stopped for a moment, picking up a charred stick and letting it fall again. "Others walked here before us," he murmured almost to himself. "We walk in their shadows, and one day others will walk in ours." As the sun slid toward the horizon, here the wind funneled through in a constant, restless sigh. The soldiers called a halt in a small copse of trees where the snow had drifted deep the branches overhead, creaking softly in the breeze. Fires were lit quickly, and the smell of smoke mingled with the faint scent of pine. Aylin sat close to the flames, thawing her hands. The boy she had given the corn kernel to came and sat beside her. Without a word, he pulled it from his pocket and held it out for her to see, still wrapped in the same strip of cloth, still whole. "It's waiting," he said simply and slipped it back into his pocket. That night, Elder Ahivi gathered the children and spoke of planting seasons, the way the earth must rest before it can give the patience required to wait for the first green shoots. "A seed knows its time," he told them, "even in the coldest ground." Aylin fell asleep with those words in her mind, the warmth of the fire on her face and the steady presence of the basket under her arm. She dreamed of a field where every seed from the basket had taken root, the plants weaving together in a green tapestry. And in the dream she was not alone. Her people walked among the rows, their voices rising in songs that reached farther than the wind. The morning after Elder Ahivi's lesson was clear and brittle, the kind of cold that made sound travel farther. The march began early, the snow crunching underfoot as the column wound its way out of the narrow defile and into open country again. The land ahead rolled in gentle swells, dotted here and there with clumps of dark cedar. The sky, a pale blue washed thin by winter, seemed to stretch forever. Aylin kept her pace between her parents, the seed basket nestled under her arm, as if it had always been there. The air was sharp but clean, and she found herself breathing more deeply, as though the horizon itself was pulling her forward. By midday, they reached a frozen stream that ran shallow over a bed of stones. The crossing was quick, the ice holding under their boots, and on the far side, the trail bent south toward a stand of leafless cottonwoods. The soldiers called a short halt there, and people spread out among the trees, shaking snow from cloaks and tending to their fires. Aylin sat on a fallen trunk with her mother, sharing a strip of dried venison. Nearby Elder Ahivi was showing a young girl how to mend a broken strap using a strip of rawhide. His hands moved slowly, his voice low and steady, but his eyes scanned the camp in small, deliberate sweeps, as if he was measuring the strength left in his people. The break was brief. Soon they were moving again, and the trail began to climb toward a ridge lined with low scrub. The wind picked up at the crest, carrying with it the faint smell of wood smoke, not from their own camp, but from somewhere farther west. A murmur ran through the line. Was it a settlement, a trading post, or simply another group on the move? As the sun lowered, the wind sharpened, and the soldiers urged them to make camp before darkness fell. They found shelter in a shallow basin surrounded by stunted pines, their branches heavy with snow. Fires bloomed quickly in the hollows between drifts, their light flickering on the faces gathered around them. Aylin's father returned from speaking with a soldier, his face unreadable. 2 more days, he said quietly as he sat beside the fire. If the weather holds, we'll reach the new lands. Her mother's hand found Aylin's under the blanket. The news sat heavy and light at once. 2 days, until the road ended. 2 days, until whatever waited would become home. That night, Elder Ahivi visited their fire. He sat in silence for a long moment, watching the flames before speaking. "This road will not end when we stop walking," he said. "It will live in the stories you tell, in the seeds you plant, in the way you remember those who walked beside you." Aylin held the basket a little tighter. The wind shifted, carrying the scent of smoke from other fires in the basin, mingling them into one. She thought of the boy with his single corn kernel, of the old woman her father had helped, of every hand that had reached for another along the way. When she lay down to sleep, the stars above the basin seemed closer than usual, as if leaning down to listen. The road was almost finished, but she knew Elder Ahivi was right. Some journeys keep walking long after your feet have stopped. The morning they set out from the basin, the air was still, the sky a flat wash of pale gray. Snow squeaked underfoot in the hard cold, and each exhale puffed white before vanishing. The soldiers moved with quiet efficiency. No barked orders, no impatient gestures. Everyone seemed to sense the same thing: the road was nearing its end. The land began to change as they walked. The hills softened into long, low swells, and the snow grew thinner in patches, giving way to dark earth that smelled faintly of thaw. In the distance, a line of trees marked the edge of a river valley. The closer they came, the clearer the sound of water grew, a steady murmur that reminded Aylin of home, though the voice of this river was different, deeper. When they reached the bank, the river lay broad and dark, its surface moving slow but strong. A crude bridge of planks and rope spanned the narrowest point. One by one, families crossed their steps, cautious, the boards creaking under each weight. Aylin's father led the way, his hand steady on her shoulder as they moved. When her boots touched the far bank, she let out a breath that felt as if she'd been holding it for weeks. Beyond the river, the ground rose into a wide plateau. The soldiers halted the column there, gesturing toward the stretch of land ahead. "This is it," one of them said simply. No speeches, no ceremony, just the quiet fact of arrival. Aylin looked out over the new lands. The soil was dark, the kind her father had spoken of by the fire. Patches of dried grass bent in the wind, and in the distance a stand of bare oaks stood against the sky. It wasn't home, not yet, but it was ground that could be planted, ground that could hold roots. Around her, people began to move again, some walking forward into the open space, others simply standing as if letting the truth settle into them. Elder Ahivi stood at the front, his gaze sweeping over the land. He turned to face the people, his voice carrying in the cold air. "We have walked far," he said, "and we have carried more than our feet could measure. Now we plant. Not just seeds, but ourselves." Aylin felt her mother's hand squeeze hers. She knelt in the cold earth and set the basket before her, loosening the cloth that covered it. The kernels inside were warm from her body's heat. One by one, she took them in her hand, pressing them into the soil. Around her, others began to do the same: corn beans, sunflower seeds, small offerings to a land that did not yet know them but would. As the wind moved over the plateau, it carried with it the faintest echo of voices, those who had walked before, those who had fallen along the way. Aylin closed her eyes and listened, her fingers resting in the dark, cold soil. She thought of the river that remembered of the boy's single corn kernel, of every step that had brought them here. When she opened her eyes, the horizon seemed closer, and for the first time in many weeks, she felt the weight in her chest ease. The road behind her was long and heavy, but ahead lay something different, not an ending, but a beginning. And in the stillness that followed with the seeds planted and the people gathered, Aylin understood the trail of tears would always be part of them, but so would the fields that would one day grow here, green and full under a kinder sun.